inflation is still running above that 2% level. And the last thing we want is, a situation like back in the 60s, 70s where inflation kept popping up and then they had to keep, driving interest rates up, and this kind of game of whack-a-mole. I think Powell and the Fed are really trying to vanquish inflation once and for all this time around instead of having to deal with it, a year from now.
Welcome to Reporter's Notebook, where we talk to the Washington Examiner's top journalists about the stories breaking on their beats. I'm Jim Anton. I'm joined today by economics reporter Zach Halaschak. And Zach, we've just had Crypto Week. Talk a little bit about what that means.
Yeah, it's a big deal. Obviously, cryptocurrency advocates have been waiting a long time to get some landmark crypto legislation out there. We got one of those, at least out of the three that were passed, is called the Genius Act, and that establishes a framework for stablecoins, which are a form of cryptocurrency that you don't typically think of as cryptocurrency. Like Bitcoin, it fluctuates in value. Stablecoins typically are pegged and are set at one stable value and should be backed one-to-one by treasury or reserves by whatever's holding that crypto asset. But the Senate already passed this legislation, and so the House looks poised to pass it, and that would mean the first big crypto legislation signed into law for a regulatory framework. And so this is going to go to President Trump's desk. He's expected to sign it. There's also the anti-CBDC legislation. A CBDC is a central bank digital currency. So essentially, in very simple terms, like a crypto that issued by the federal government that people can use as trade of value or that sort of thing. That is also likely to pass. And then there's the Clarity Act, which establishes sort of a market structure for the rest of the crypto world, what's considered by the SEC to be regulated by the SEC, what's considered going to be considered a commodity to be regulated by the CFTC. So this whole tranche of legislation was a big deal, and there was a lot of kind of drama surrounding it, especially when it came to a CBDC.
So tensions between President Trump and Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell sort of heated up this week, but according to Trump at least, it's not going to necessarily culminate in a firing. Where do things stand right now?
Yeah, so earlier this week there was kind of a flurry of reports saying that it was imminent that Trump was going to fire Powell, which would be an unprecedented move, never been done before by a president to a Federal Reserve chief. The Trump administration has obviously been attacking Powell for months, but kind of started recently to dig into like an inquiry on overspending on the headquarters of the Fed here in D.C., kind of like teeing up maybe something for cause, trying to find some reason. And then Trump got on camera in the Oval Office just hours after these reports came out and said, no, the firing is not imminent. He's still a big opponent of Powell's. This kind of shows the back and forth and kind of game of brinksmanship that both, the White House is sort of playing with the Fed right now. Trump is very unhappy that Powell's not lowering interest rates faster. Doesn't seem like Powell's set to do that anytime soon. I think most markets say they expect maybe one more rate cut this year, which is a lot different than maybe 6 months, a year ago, where they were thinking that there might be several rate cuts this year. So anytime a sitting president is looking at monetary policy, they want to see rate cuts, not rates to stay the same or rates to increase. So it's kind of put Powell in a very tough situation because he wants to make sure that monetary policy is the way that the Fed board believes it should be, and inflation doesn't crop back up. But at the same time, he's battling Trump over on his right shoulder, and just the economy more generally, which when you have interest rates higher for longer, typically tends to start to deteriorate.
Right. So you mentioned inflation as one of the sort of the sticking points between President Trump and Chairman Powell, and there have been a couple of competing metrics that people look at to gauge inflation that have told slightly different stories, and obviously there's the whole question of what impact, if any, are the Trump tariffs having on the inflation rate. Where do things stand right now? What's the real story here?
Yeah, so the real story is that there's not a clear idea of what's exactly happening. So it's not like every inflation report's consistently going up or every inflation report is consistently going down. It's kind of a mixed bag. So just this week is a good example of that. You had the Consumer Price Index, which is kind of the most closely watched inflation gauge, go up 0.3 of a percentage point to 2.7%. For reference, the Fed wants inflation to be running right around 2%. So, pretty notably higher than what inflation should be running at. And then you had the Producer Price Index, which is kind of like wholesale inflation, showed it tick down actually, which was unexpected, to 2.3%, close to that 2% target. And then, as you mentioned, the uncertainty around tariffs, it's kind of challenging because if Trump were to just put tariffs across the board and leave him at that and we know they're going to stay at that, it's pretty easy to see what's going to happen. But the tariff, deadlines and everything keeps moving around, so it's
right.
kind
They
of
keep
tough.
talking about different deals. They keep, it was mid-July, August 1st. Possibility of changes from that.
Yeah, so it's kind of hard to see what exactly is how big of an effect tariffs are having, because it's like not a consistent set thing. It's a evolving beast, if you will. And
sure.
Many economists are, kind of expecting, if tariffs continue to stay in place, that price pressures will go up in the later half of the year. But we have seen a little bit of price increases in some areas, but I think it's been largely not as much as expected. I remember talking to some economists at the start of the year, right during Liberation Day, who expected prices to explode, that sort of thing. We haven't really seen that. So it gives Trump a little bit of ammo and wanting rates lower. But again, inflation is still running above that 2% level. And the last thing we want is, a situation like back in the 60s, 70s, where inflation kept popping up, and then they had to keep, driving interest rates up, and this kind of game of whack-a-mole. I think Powell and the Fed are really trying to vanquish inflation once and for all this time around, instead of having to deal with it, a year from now.
Whip inflation now, as the kids used to say.
That's true.
Thank you, Zach.
Thanks.
You can read Zach and the rest of our policy team's coverage at washingtonexaminer.com.